Okay, guys. So recently I was on a podcast called Camp Gagnon with the comedian Mark Gagnon. We ended up talking a lot about transhumanism, simulation theory, things of that nature. And the algorithm seems to have got wind of that because I've been getting all kinds of things about transhumanism all of a sudden showing up on my YouTube feed of my bobber. And it showed me this, which was this. Let's see. Can we prove life is a simulation? Anil Seth versus Anders Sandberg on the simulation theory. This is from the Institute of Art and Ideas, which is a very cool organization slash channel, whatever they do. If you aren't familiar with them, I don't know, you probably haven't been around YouTube, but they put out a lot of these kind of discussions and they host various events and stuff like that. I think they're based in New York. I don't really know. Anyway, so they do some cool stuff. You have to subscribe, and so I don't really like that stuff. But they also do how the light gets in, right? Isn't that them? I don't really know. Anyway, okay, so there's that. It looks interesting. Now, Anders Sandberg, I know he's at the Future for of Humanity Institute or something like that, where Nick Bostrom is running it. And then there's don't say Bostrom. The simulation is angry. The basilisk, man. Okay, anyway, and then Anil Seth. I've never talked to Anil. Pete Mandic and I, once a long time ago for Spacetime Mind, we invited Anil Seth to come on, and he agreed, and we all had it all set up. But we were using Google Hangouts way back then. And for whatever reason, was it Google Hangout? I forget. It was they were phasing it out at that point. We didn't know about StreamYard. Anyway, long story short, it didn't work. And we tried very hard to connect with him. It didn't work. And then I've tried to set up some conversations with him since then, and no takers. So that's too bad. I would have liked to talk with him. I think Anil's a cool guy, interesting views. But anyway, cool. So I don't really know either of these guys. I don't really know much about this event, but they want to talk about the simulation stuff, and I have some interest in this stuff. So let's go ahead. Feel free to check it out. I sort of fast forwarded the intro stuff. Who is this over here? Is this Sabine Hoffen? What's her name? Hoffenfelden? I don't know names very well. That's Anil. This looks like Anders. This is the host. I don't know who she is, and I don't know who that is. Maybe they'll tell us. Do they tell us down here? They don't tell us that I can see. Okay, cool.
Wrote the paper about the simulation.
Oh, so I think what? No.
Hollywood fantasy.
My boss, Nick Bostrom.
Oh, she said is simulation theory something that could be real or Hollywood fantasy. So now he's talking about his boss. I didn't know his boss. Okay, Bostrom. His name is Bostrom. He's the boss.
Wrote the paper.
What did he say?
A real possibility? Or is this a sign that we can all be victims to a Hollywood fantasy?
My boss, Nick Bostrom, wrote the paper about the simulation argument. So just quickly outline it. He argues that if we survive and get our act together as a species, we're going to develop an advanced post-human civilization with enormous computing power. And at least some of that is going to be used to run simulations of our past because of entertainment.
Yeah, so these are so-called ancestor simulations. By the way, so in Chalmers' book, Reality Plus, he kind of criticizes, I guess what you criticize before. Simulation is not happy about this video I'm doing. He kind of criticizes Bostrom's formulation of the argument because he doesn't think that the primary reason for running simulations would be something to do with ancestor simulations. The progeny of ours running simulations of their ancestors. So Chalmers doesn't think that's the right way to put it. Okay, so but
historical dramas or figuring out what really happened in those important years in the early 21st century. And of course, that's going to be a lot of simulations. So hence, it seems like if you're a mind in the early 21st century, you might actually more likely be one of the simulated minds rather than one of the few minds that exist in the real world. So his paper ends up with a trilemma. We have to believe it.
And Neil, look at that face. What was that? Let's go back here just a second. What was that?
Years in the early 21st century. And of course, that's going to be a lot of simulations. So hence, it seems like if you're a mind in the early 21st century, you might actually more likely be one of the simulated minds rather than one of the few minds that exist in the real world. So his paper ends up with...
But okay, so yeah, if right now most of the kind of creatures having experience like mine and yours are simulated, then chances are we're one of the simulated ones. If most experiences like this are simulated, that's the real structure of the argument. If there ever is a point at which most of the experiences like yours are simulated, then you probably are in a simulation. So there's two scenarios. Either this isn't a simulation and we haven't got to a point where most experiences like yours exist in a simulated world, or we have got to that point and you are one of these simulated, more than likely one of these simulated persons. So the question is, what reason do we have to believe the first option rather than the second? And then there's some math involved in how you would calculate the probabilities or something like that. Okay.
Trilemma. We have to believe in at least one really annoying or crazy thing. Either that we will never reach this post-human state, that we will go extinct because of some global disaster, or that post-humans never do this simulation, either because it's impossible to actually do, or because we're all deciding, oh, that would be totally unethical, subjecting people to the world of 2021. No, that's not ethical, not even to simulated people. Or the third possibility, we're actually happily simulated.
Well, I don't like the simulation argument, but that's not in itself a good reason to dismiss it, although it's pretty good. The simulation argument that Anders beautifully summarized is really weak in a couple of ways. Firstly, it asks us to assign probabilities to things that we have really no idea how to assign probabilities to. What would our far distant ancestors feel like doing with some extrapolation of the kinds of technology that we have today? People have an idea.
That is one of the weaknesses of that version of the simulation argument, which is why I think the Chalmers kind of art style version of this is better, because it doesn't sort of postulate that there are ancestors, or progeny or whatever you call them in the forward version of ancestors, who are simulating their ancestors. That's rather, it just sort of says that there will be a point in the future where simulated realities outnumber regular realities. And that is based on extrapolation from how many simulated versions of reality we have now. So that as computing power sort of ramps up, one expects that there will just be more and more of these high-level detailed simulations, so that at some point there will be more simulated reality indistinguishable from this reality as real reality. And so once you factor in, things like pathways through augmented reality, virtual reality, headsets, etc. And so you just imagine, you put on your PlayStation 2 or Quest N whatever headset, and then you're playing Halo or Resident Evil or whatever the case may be. Obviously, you're playing something much more wholesome than Biohazard in VR, which is quite scary, by the way. I was too creeped out. This is beside the point. I literally had to take the headset off because I needed to check I was still in my living room. Too creepy. Too creepy. Okay. Anyways, so that's a simulated world with digital objects, I would say. Okay. So that's why that argument is better, I would say, extrapolating from what we're doing already and just imagining it kind of getting better and better and better. So the VR version of Resident Evil is pretty good, but still not totally realistic. I didn't smell the smells and sensory stimulus, etc. Many things were missing. But you can imagine kind of building those in, ramping it up until the point where you get a VR that's kind of indistinguishable, like a Resident Evil that's indistinguishable from like this right now. That'd be really creepy. even more creepy, one might think, intolerably creepy. Who knows? But the point is that that style of arguing for the simulation hypothesis doesn't fall prey to these kinds of worries. It basically just says in the future there's going to be populations of persons that create these simulated worlds, and soon they're going to outnumber they'll be from the point when they're indistinguishable from the real world, they will start to outnumber real reality, so that any given experiencer like you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between the simulated reality and what you're in right now. So that's not a problem for that style of argument. Okay, anyway, let's let him finish.
What a computer simulation tends to mean, probably motivated by a desire that we might, if this is true, we could upload ourselves into the cloud and live forever. So we're asked to assign probabilities where we don't have a good idea what those probabilities should be. More importantly, it's not just a...
Yeah, but so you can do a little bit of work here by figuring out what your credences are. Like as Chalmers puts it, you have sim blockers and, well, I don't know. Anyway, so there's a lot of details here. And, you can't know, I think you can't know that you are in a simulation. But the claim, really, the interesting claim is you can't know that you aren't. So that's why the disjunction, you have to accept one of these. Either, there's something that's going to stop it, or it's not possible, or probably it's already happened. Those are the likely scenarios. I don't think this style of argument really gets at it. Okay, but it does address what Anders was saying. I agree.
Trilemma. I think it's a quadrilemma. I'm not even sure if that is a word.
Is that a word?
That is another fundamental assumption in all these ideas that is glossed over. And this is the idea that consciousness is substrate independent, as Bostrom himself puts it in his lovely paper.
Yeah.
That it doesn't matter whether brains are made of carbon or silicon, that if you run the right program on a computer of some kind, consciousness will happen. He says...
Right, exactly. So this actually, again, in the Chalmers version of this, he puts this in as a sim blocker, so that the conclusion that really falls out, his argument is if there are no sim blockers, then we're probably in a simulation or something like that. So yeah, interesting. This is where I want to put my money and where my hopes and dreams lay. Although in my old age, it is hard to see what it is that would really, beyond me or like wanting it to be that way, would really make it the case that consciousness depends on something non-simulatable or substrate dependent. It could turn out to be that way, and if the identity theory is true, then I think it is that way largely, although maybe even if it's identical enough at the high level property, who knows. So yes, I agree with Anil that this is a problem, but you can still reason it in the following way, insofar as I find it, parentheses, likely, unlikely, possible, impossible, adjust your level of acceptance in the substrate independence of the mind, then blah, blah, blah. So I think that you can still, Chalmers gets to at least 25 or something like that %, but I don't know if you can really get those kind of numbers. I think Anil's right. We're not really going to have to put the numbers here, but still you can give some sense to how probable do you think it is that you could be simulated or that you could have conscious experience just like yours in a simulation. So whereas Bostrom puts that as a assumption of the argument, Chalmers actually makes it into one of the premises, puts in the antecedent of the conditional, if there are no sim blockers then. So if these things work out, now that's a fairly weak claim that Chalmers is making. And that's why I think his version of the argument is better, because it's not as committed to much. But anyway, okay, so I think Anil's on the right target here.
This is widely accepted in philosophy of mind and in neuroscience. It is somewhat accepted, but that's also not by everyone, and it's not obvious at all that this is the case. There are some things which, if you simulate them, you bring them about. A computer playing chess actually is playing chess. There are other things that if you simulate them, you just simulate them. You don't actually instantiate them. If you have a simulation of a weather system, it doesn't actually get wet. It's a simulation of a weather system. So where does consciousness...
Yeah, but look, this is a tired point. I've ranted about this 100 trillion times, but just because we're here and I'm in a ranting mood, you have to be really careful with this. And it really depends on whether you're taking the perspective of the simulation or the perspective of outside the simulation, whether what Anil just said is true. So outside the simulation, water, rain have certain meanings. So those things are not in the computer. What's in the computer is a bunch of code and hardware and stuff. So the things I call water and rain are not in the simulation. And from my point of view, outside the simulation, that stuff is not water, it's not wet, etc. But if there really were a simulated world, then from the point of view of that simulation, a creature in that simulation would call that water. That would be water for that creature's point of view. So it would be wet. Simulated water makes simulated objects simulated wet. And if you're in a simulated world, then what you mean by object and wet and water are the simulated versions of it. So therefore, it's just true from the simulation's point of view that the water makes things wet. So it's not 100% clear. I mean, I get that the general point is that whether you're inside or outside the simulation, a simulation of the computer is still a computer. So that point stands. And it is an open question whether simulating the brain produces consciousness. So I'm not disagreeing with the basic point that he's making here. But I am sort of saying that this is too quick of a way to demonstrate that point, because it kind of neglects or glosses over this very important distinction about the meaning of the words wet and water and so forth, and how they depend on the context and what sort of, this is, bringing Putnam and all these things we've been talking about on this channel lately together. Whatever your views about the semantics of natural kind terms like water and so forth, they have some relation to the environment, which latches on to it. Whether that's a part of the whole thing, people can debate, but it's there. So whether the simulated water makes things simulated wet, I mean, saying simulated water makes things wet is a category mistake, because wet is a thing that's out here. Now, of course, things are complicated if you're thinking of out here as in a simulation, but just if you sort of bracket that question, it's pretty clear that things matter, whether you're taking the viewpoint of the inside of the simulation or from outside of it. And that corresponds to these, sort of 2D semantic moves that people like Chalmers like to make. So that's why I think Chalmers's version of this argument just a lot clearer. A lot of these irrelevant objections don't come up. I mean, they're interesting to talk about, give me something to do as I'm waiting for the weather to warm up. But still. Okay.
On the spectrum, I don't actually know, but I'm very suspicious of assuming that it is something that we can simulate.
Basically, that trilemma or that quadrilemma shows that there is something wrong here. Something in the reasoning that led us up to this situation is really wonky. And that is useful to know. Then we might say, okay, I totally believe that one is not plausible at all, or this tension, we can investigate that. We can get in front of a whiteboard and try to see if I can make a model that shows the right kind of local symmetries. We can get over to the questions about, wait a minute, credibility and plausibility and possibility here. Maybe that is actually breaking the argument, but notice that these things are internal in some sense to the philosophical thing. It doesn't tell us that much about whether this reality is actually simulated. For that, we need to look for pop-up windows or some weird bug in physics.
I mean, that leads me on to the burning.
So, well, interesting, because even those would be suggestive but not proof by themselves. So what's his point is that the only kind of evidence that you could really have would be some kind of really simulated looking type evidence that didn't have the, so the quadrilemma, the only way I don't really follow what he was just saying. So let's just go back 1 second.
Credibility and plausibility and possibility here. Maybe that is actually breaking the argument, but notice that these things are internal in some sense to the philosophical thing. It doesn't tell us that much about whether this reality is actually simulated. For that, we need to look for pop-up windows or some weird.
So this argument doesn't tell us about whether this reality is simulated. That's exactly what it's supposed to be doing, and to get us to think that there's at least some that we can't rule out, that we don't know, that we can't say for certain that what's around us is. And I guess I kind of, have to agree that we can't rule out or don't know that this isn't simulated, that I'm not in a simulation right now. Now, there's different versions of this, and obviously the more extreme versions say, the simulation just started right now, including my memories of recording videos earlier, including your memories of like watching those videos or not earlier, etc. So that's pretty extreme. You can't refute that. But this idea that I live in a simulation, I was born in one, so were you, that's less radical. So I think both of them we kind of can't obviously rule out 100%. One I kind of don't take as seriously, the one that the simulation just turned on, because it would be very at odds with like all the other stuff that I think that I know, and very complicated to set up and so forth. Doesn't mean it's impossible, it just means I'm not worried about it. The other one, have we always been in a simulation? Was I born in one, were you, etc.? That I think is a different kind of question. But that's exactly the kind of question that this original quadrilemma thing was supposed to get us to think about. Interesting. Yeah, I'm not sure what to make of all this. Okay, let's continue though.
Bug in physics.
I mean, that leads me on to the burning question that I have. I don't know about any of you right now, but like, what would it take to prove that? Like, how are we going to prove if we are or aren't in a simulation?
Suppose we go out into space and finally meet aliens, and they turn out to be a real advanced super civilization, and they are running zillions and zillions of ancestor simulations of their own ancestors in order to find out some weird alien questions about history. That seems to be the kind of evidence that would change our plausibilities a bit, because we know at least that looks like they, for some reason, are able to do. Then maybe we are simulated.
You want to try getting a grant for that?
Well, yeah. Wow, okay. Why would we need aliens? I mean, we're doing this already, where we simulate early universe, evolution of galaxies, airplanes and wind tunnels, World War II simulations in video games, outside of video games. So evolutionary simulations, all this stuff is going on now. So now if we met some aliens that were simulating their ancestors, okay, yeah. I don't know why he doesn't just rely on this idea that we ourselves are getting more advanced in our simulations, that they're more and more realistic, that you can kind of see a trend. I mean, I know I started with Pong. That was my first video game. And now I got Resident Evil in VR. So it's been quite a wild ride. If you think about the trajectory of that, the difference between those. So you can kind of imagine that going out further. Why do we need these aliens? All we would need is this idea that, I mean, one, it's probable that there maybe are aliens. It's probable that civilizations, when they get to a certain level, will start doing this. Look at the trajectory we're on as the evidence. Yeah, I don't really see that we need this. But I also don't think you could ever prove that you're in a simulation, like outright 100% or not. So why do we, I mean, the question is, can you prove that you're not in a simulation? Is usually the one that people worry the most about. And I don't think you can, by the way. So whether you can prove you're in one, that's a different question. I think just even establishing A, that you don't know you're not, and B, there's some reason to think maybe you are, is interesting enough already.
Yes, first we need a space program.
Especially
to
a
find
5-year grant.
Yeah, might need a, yeah.
Yeah, very happy to do it.
Well, I think it's. I mean, I think it is a little. It's a little much to ask of it to come up with proof or evidence. It doesn't seem the kind of thing that evidence can bear on in a useful way, at least in the near-term horizon. I do think the value of it, in as much as there is in just probing some of the natural sort of rivers of thinking that we tend to apply. Ultimately, I still think there's great reason to be skeptical of both the argument. So we should distinguish as well the argument, which is this trilemma or quadrilemma, from the hypothesis that this is actually the case, right? So you could actually turn it the other way around. This is probably really bad philosophy, but you could turn it the other way around and say, okay, this is actually the simulation argument is a very good argument against functionalism, because if functionalism is true, then the simulation argument might follow, and that seems bonkers. So let's not do that. But that's not good. But I do think it's useful how it changes the way we think.
I like it.
I don't think bonkers doesn't necessarily mean that the argument is wrong.
It's true, though. I mean, so interesting. They cut it off there, but yeah, I'm on the side of Anders there. The idea that we're in a simulation does seem bonkers. But is it as bonkers as finding out about string theory, quantum mechanics, relativity? I mean, physical reality as described so far is bonkers. Why couldn't it be even a little bit one stage bonkier and have a substrate of hardware? I don't think there's anything inherently implausible. That because of my own background and beliefs, I tend to think, there's some chance that we're in a simulation, but I wouldn't put it up as high as people like David Chalmers would. But I wouldn't be much far down below. So I would say we can't rule it out with anywhere near like reasonable amounts of certainty, even if there's only a 5%, 10% chance that I should believe we're in a simulated route. That's pretty significant. There's 5%, 10% chance of planes going down. I'm not getting on that plane as far as I know. So I do think that these things are worth taking seriously. And I do think that we have a legitimate set of arguments that suggest, A, we don't know that this is not happening, so we can't rule out the simulation hypothesis. It's not silly, therefore, as a thesis about the nature of physical reality or the world that we find ourselves in. Furthermore, given that suggests that you can't rule out, that you don't know that well, okay, so I don't know. I don't want to go into all this stuff. So some people would say you don't know that a physical world exists. I would say no, the physical world does exist. I'm sort of on the Chalmers side about that. But those are different questions, different topics. Maybe we'll come back to this because since this podcast is going to come out where I'm talking about transhumanism and singularity and all this stuff, maybe we should talk about it here too. Maybe not. We'll see.